Morning. We are going to take a look today at National Park Service planning, and we've lost a screen here. All right, so looking at two major parts, we're looking at a general management plan and the predecessor to that, the statement of management. And then at the very end, we're going to look at a specific project plan, even though they'll get mentioned throughout. Okay, so you may be familiar with this statement from the 1916 Organic Act. Remember, Yellowstone got started in 1872, but we don't get a Park Service itself till 1916, and this is their infamous statement from Congress to promote and regulate the use of federal areas known as the national parks, monuments, and reservations by such means and measures as conform to the fundamental purpose of said parks, monuments, and reservations, which purpose is to, and I'm brightly colored here, conserve the scenery and natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and, so this is a big and, to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such a manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So that's the balancing act that the Park Service is always working on. It will never go away. And of course, it's open to opinion. So yeah, unimpaired is, how can you have people, the public out there and have it be unimpaired? So we are balancing these two. Among the management tools, or among the management concepts that have developed since 1916, there is this possibility to temporarily close an area so it's not being used by the public. And yeah, that's among the tools that might sound counterintuitive. And it took a long time into the 1980s before they got that into writing. Also broadening that statement of unimpaired and preservation. Again, the 1988 management planning documents, it's no longer sufficient to consider strategies and actions solely within the boundaries of the parks. The National Park Service will work cooperatively with surrounding landowners and managers to help ensure that actions outside the parks do not impair park resources and values. That's both Forest Service lands, BLM lands, and private lands that the Park Service will speak to those people and have an influence on them. Okay, and it's not just the physical resources. So looking at this statement, the National Park Service management policies use the terms resource and values to mean the full spectrum of tangible and intangible attributes for which parks have been established and are being managed. Intangible qualities such as natural quiet, solitude, space, scenery, and a sense of history, sounds of nature, and clear night skies are just among the list. It's a longer list, and then there's more that's not listed. But just giving the idea that it isn't just the physical ground and the physical plants and the physical wildlife, that there are these other values. The statement here is that each area within the National Park Service shall be administered in accordance with the provisions of any statute made specifically applicable to that area. This is an area where it's different from the Forest Service. When we look at Forest Service and BLM lands, most of the directives for planning are really, really broad. And national parks, though, the National Park Service, as you saw a couple slides back, started 40, 50 years after we were establishing national parks. So each national park has its own enabling legislation, and we're going to take a look at a few quotes out of them. So this is 1934, the enabling legislation for Monocacy National Battlefield. So to commemorate the Battle of Monocacy, Maryland, hopefully I'm saying that close to correctly, and to preserve for historic purposes the breastworks, earthworks, walls, and other defenses or shelters used by the armies therein. So that's pretty specific as to what they are preserving, and it's very physical. So that's 1930, and being that narrow has caused some problems with lots of uh, um, conflicts about the purpose. So purposes have gotten much longer since then. So this is 1980, so 50 years later, at the creation of, uh, shoot, I lost it. There we go. The Gates Arctic National Park and Preserve. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the depth of their description of what they're preserving. To maintain the wild and undeveloped character of the area, including opportunities for the visitors to experience solitude, and natural integrity and scenic beauty of the mountains, forelands, rivers, lakes, and other natural features, to provide continued opportunities, including reasonable access for mountain climbing, mountaineering, and other recreational activities, and to protect habitat for and the populations of fish, wildlife, including but not limited to caribou, grizzly bears, Dall sheep, moose, wolves, raptors, raptorial birds, there. So you can see that over time, we've recognized a need to go into more detail on the purposes of each individual park. Okay, one way that we can study or take a look at national parks and their management plans is to study new area criteria. So before an area can be added to the national park system, the National Park Service is going to study the area and determine if they're, I'll give you a set of criteria, nationally significant, and if so, should they be in the National Park Service system. So to be eligible, these are the criteria that have been written out, and I'll go through them quickly here and then we'll go back into detail. First, possess nationally significant natural, cultural, or recreational resources. Second, be a suitable and feasible addition to the system. And third, require direct National Park Service management instead of alternative protection by other agencies or the private sector. So let's take a look at these one at a time. The first one, possess nationally significant natural, cultural, or recreational resources. This is an interesting one because nationally significant and locally significant can be different. So we do have to think at a national level. So we're looking at, when we split that out, outstanding example of a particular type of resource. Resources broadly defined mostly as the physical, but you also have seen that other values are brought in. Exceptional value or quality illustrating or interpreting the natural cultural themes of our national heritage. So it's not just physical resources, heritage is a big part, and superlative opportunities for recreation, public use, and enjoyment, or for scientific study. These words get argued over. Superlative, what does that mean? Exceptional, what does that mean? Outstanding, what does that mean? And then recreation, public use, and enjoyment, or for scientific study. Does it mean if it's one, it's not the other? Yeah, these things get argued in court. All right, second one, be suitable and feasible addition to the system. So suitable, what does that mean? So it represents a natural cultural theme or type of recreational resource that's not already represented. So is Escalante enough different from the San Rafael Swell, enough different from Canyonlands? Yeah, if you're a Utahn, you might not see a lot of difference between them, but if you're from outside, you might consider each one of those outstanding. Okay, the second part, such an area is comparably protected or presented for public enjoyment by another land management agency. So is it a state park? Is the BLM treating it as a special area? Same with the Forest Service. So yeah, if it's already being protected in some way, maybe the Park Service isn't needed. Then looking at feasible, Park Service generally likes larger areas. If it's going to be a national park or a natural park, historic settings don't need to be as big, but we are discovering that some history is pretty broad. So Bears Ears is an example of a national monument set aside for historic use by the Ute and the Navajo in the area, and for prehistoric use was really, really broad down in that area. You can find ruins and petroglyphs across hundreds of square miles. And then is it feasible to ensure long-term protection and accommodate public use? And can it be efficiently administered at a reasonable cost? And what about land acquisition costs? More often than not, we just are looking at federal lands. How's the access to the area? Are there significant threats to the resource that at a national level we want to protect that through national parks as opposed to having it open to development? All right, third, require that the direct National Park Service management instead of alternative protection by other agencies or private sector. So again, we're looking at whether the states or other federal agencies, if they already own the land, are they doing a good job? Okay, so new additions not recommended if the Park Service feels like they're adequately protected in another manner. Other arrangements down here at the bottom. This is happening more often. 40 years ago, you didn't see this. But often now, whoever is the land manager, both the BLM and the Forest Service, have areas where they are given the management of a national, especially national monuments. So Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante in Utah, Mount St. Helens in Washington are managed either by the BLM or the Forest Service. So it's interesting that they will be wearing their Forest Service uniforms or their BLM uniforms and yet be managing a national monument. So the Park Service, the National Park Service, continues to advise them and opens their services up to them, but they're still the people in uniform, and their payroll comes through the other federal agencies. Now we've frozen here. Let's see what happens. Okay, I think we're moving again. I got ahead of myself. So here we are at the bottom of this. The technical and financial assistance to others can be through the National Park Service. So there is some cooperative arrangements with other agencies. And then the quick review, I'm just going to put these up really fast. There they are. So an example of cooperative management, not as strong as it used to be. There was a period where the Forest Service and the National Park Service up in American Fork Canyon worked a lot together. So the relatively small national monument of Timpanogos Cave is surrounded entirely by national forests there on the north end of Timpanogos, Mount Timpanogos in American Fork Canyon. There are very few visitor services in that tiny little national monument. However, up the road a few miles, there are a number of Forest Service campgrounds and areas managed by the Forest Service. And it used to be that there was a pretty good cooperation, and the experts, the National Park Service interpretive rangers, would go up to the Forest Service and give evening programs at the campgrounds. So I've heard from a few students lately that have worked for the Park Service there that that's not happening anymore, but just depends who the management is, the superintendent, and what times and budgets are looking like. Okay, let's take a little deeper look at planning, both the process of planning and the products that it produces, which used to always be paper, now they're digital. Okay, planning will be conducted in a dynamic and continuous process for making choices. Dynamic meaning it's constantly changing, and yet we do have printed documents that are meant to stand for 15 years, even though they do get modified. Okay, we're going to start with if we're imagining a brand new national park or monument or recreation area, they begin with what's called phase one, a statement for management. So it's not nearly the document that there will eventually be the general management plan, but boy, when a president sets aside an area, they need to get managing it pretty darn quickly. So they're putting together first this smaller document, though it's going to look huge to you. These are supposed to be replaced within 3 years. Occasionally there are exceptions in getting the general management plan written. You might recall for Bears Ears here in Utah that the statement for management was written, and within 3 years our president shrank the monument, the second president under that. So the statement for management is still active. It's been modified. There isn't a general management plan because the courts are looking at it and saying whether that shrinking the monument was legal or not. Okay, but typically, let's move past that. These would be reviewed every 2 years and revised, or better yet, get the general management plan done. But let's take a look at what the statement for management would include. And it would include information about the park's purpose. So this is the mission statement essentially for that park. A lot of that can be pulled out of the original document creating the place. Then taking a look at its resources, describing them, describing their significance, which can help you start focusing on what areas need work the most. Inventorying the existing uses of the area and describing its regional context to the other national parks and to the adjacent lands next to it. So Arches is an area, Canyonlands is an area right now where adjacent land keeps getting put up by the BLM for oil lease, and with public outcry, the BLM keeps pulling those lease opportunities. So that's a back and forth all the time issue about adjacent lands and our national parks and monuments. Okay, there's always a review and a description of legal requirements for its management, including getting a general management plan in there. And then there's also a description of visitor experiences or expected visitor experiences for the place. All right, continuing on. Non-recreation park uses by Native Americans and others. You don't see a lot of that except in a place like Bears Ears. Bears Ears, the Ute tribe and the Navajo tribe were originally going to be part of the management team as tribal members, and that's another thing that got yanked out when we switched presidents. All right, what are we going to do with all of this? We are going to identify major issues and problems that need to be addressed. We did this in our class with our SWOT evaluation, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. That was just one way to identify issues. So yes, part of the statement for management is going to be a list of major issues and problems that need to be addressed that we can see right from the beginning. Then we know we don't know everything. So looking at those major issues, what else do we need to know to define those problems and how they'll be addressed? And it's from those that we start to establish objectives, things that are very measurable in the field, that with dates and timelines and budgets that the Park Service wants to do locally. All of that into the statement for management. So looking at this statement of management, oops, went too far. Priority listings of the studies and surveys needed after the document is printed, put in place. or even while you're still working on it, you're also getting writing prescriptions for yourselves of what needs to be done. All right, so this is going to be a wild ride. Sufficient information will be available prior to initiating the plan. So let's take a look at how the Park Service is trying to cover themselves with every word they can think of. Each park will develop, gather, compile, store, analyze, update information about natural and cultural resources and regional demographic, ethnographic, and socioeconomic data relative to planning and management. That's quite a pile of prerequisites that you have to get done, get moving on to get planning funds. You have to be able to show what it is that you are planning to do with those funds. All right, where does the public come in on this? There are planning meetings at national level, regional level, and local levels. NEPA, when we talk about NEPA, you'll learn much more about this. It is required in NEPA as well as being required by the parks. So generally, especially once a place has been there for a while, there are already lists of individuals, groups, organizations, other agencies, neighboring agencies, governments, meaning cities, counties, states, commissions, concessionaires, adjacent landowners. That list is something that's gathered early on, and you are notifying those people directly as well as notifying the public in general through public announcements. And one of the things you're trying to avoid are things like this, protests out against you because you haven't done things the way that the public may have wanted. And expect protests. It's part of the job. So yeah, don't be too afraid of those. But yeah, you really want to be contacting the public early. In NEPA, we'll talk a lot more detail about bringing in the public. All right, what does a general management planning look like? So this would be phase 2 of planning for a new park. And Grand Staircase had a general management plan. It kind of got blown apart when that monument was shrunk. So let's keep going. So sets forth management concepts for the park. And no surprise, it has vision and purpose statements, the mission statements. Those are your broadest statements of what you're trying to accomplish. After that, we're getting down to some strategies and techniques for doing it. Once again, here we are talking about that you have to describe it in relation to the parks near you and the issues that are brought across all those regional other parks. And then prescriptive plans. This is the part of the planning that goes into the details of exactly what it is you want to do. And at the end, I'll show you a backcountry plan in Canyonlands, and you'll get a little more down to the very concrete planning instead of these broad regional issue planning. They get right down to what you can do on what trail, what you can do with a bicycle, where a bicycle can go. So how many people can be in a campsite. So yeah, those get down to really small detail, but right now we're talking bigger planning, broad issues. Okay, so identifying strategies and looking out at least 15 years. So we're not just saying, what are we going to do next week, next year? Those are included, but those are usually at a different level of planning. They're down in the prescriptive plans. So, but looking broadly, what do we want this place in general to look like in 15 years? What are we trying to improve? What are we trying to maintain? What are we trying to get rid of? Certainly up in Olympic National Park, where non-native goats were introduced, part of the management plan was to remove them. All right, so broad general management plan gets written every 15 years, and it has chapters for most of the smaller plans, the prescriptive plans. And because they're written at different times, you have that 15-year window for the general management plan. Then you get down to the little details of what's the access plan, what's the transportation plan, what's the backcountry plan. And so they're written years apart. And so they do get, over time, needs and recognition of needs changes. And so the general management plan will get out of sync from your newer prescriptive plans. So yeah, at least every 15 years, you've got to go get them back to being consistent with each other again. Okay, and yes, as is going on here in Bears Ears in particular, uh, during all of the general management planning, you're still operating under that statement of management, which you have to keep updating until you get the general management plan done. Okay, and yes, they're not completely set in stone. You may have a pretty good general management plan or a statement of management, and new things come up. How long have we had electric bikes? So, Forest Service in particular is right now working on how do they fit? Are they allowed on the mountain biking trails? So, yes, new things keep getting invented. What about electric skateboards? Where do they fit on this? All right, planning priorities start at the top. Congress sets the broadest direction in that originating document for the establishing document for the park. And then the chain of command starts with the National Park Service director, and then there's a regional director, and eventually each park has a superintendent. And even that's not quite a true statement because right now the superintendent for Arches, Canyonlands, and Natural Bridges is the same person. So those three parks have one superintendent. I believe that's still the case. I know that's how it's been for quite a while. Then you start getting down to the individuals that are working in the park. So this is your interdisciplinary team of park planners and park managers. So it's often called an ID team for interdisciplinary team. So this will be your park archaeologist, your backcountry specialist, your recreation manager. And there are people whose job is just planner, and they just organize the whole large group of, well, the whole team. And so even though they may not be a specialist in any one area, though often they are, and then they've worked themselves from a specialty to a broad position of planner, planners are a career. Um, and even though it's all done by a team, it's the park superintendent who is responsible. They're the ones that are going to be signing all the documents. They're the ones who might get pulled into court, not on a personal level, but on a professional level. It'll be the park superintendent, or in the Forest Service, it's the, sorry, the word left me. They use a different term. Okay, so Park Service has also got some regional planning offices. The Denver office is, it's a newer concept, the idea that each park can't have every one of those specialists. And so they house them together, and then when a certain park needs a specialist, such as a landscape architect, they contact the Denver office and they schedule a landscape architect to come and help with the planning of that specific part. So that person may need to move there for 3 months, 6 months, or commute back and forth pretty regularly. Harpers Ferry Center is another center for the Park Service planning team. They particularly specialize in interpretation. And then they can certainly contact other agencies and have a Forest Service person on the planning team if they're like the Timpanogos, if they're completely surrounded by Forest Service. They can also hire consultants. And I have a friend who has even been the acting director of the Canyonlands, Arches, Natural Bridges, but whose background is in archaeology. And she's part of a team of several archaeologists who, when she's not working directly for the Park Service. They hire themselves out for the Park Service to help do all of their archaeological work. Civil engineers for road work, um, outdoor recreation specialists, transportation specialists are often hired. There are companies that are all they do is consult. Um, so Park Service isn't, not everything is in-house is what I'm saying here. They can hire it out. NEPA is another topic. We will go into a lot more detail on NEPA. That takes a couple of different sessions to get very far into NEPA. So we're going to take a look and see what a general management plan looks like. We'll just look quickly here and try to bring this up. Okay, so here's the Capitol Reef. You can see there at the top that this thing's nearly 400 pages long. It includes the environmental impact statement, the EIS, the general management plan, and a developed concept plan in those 400 pages. So there's a lot going on here. So yeah, here's a description. They had a great history department. Not all parks have that. So you do get a good history. It begins here with a summary of all kinds of stuff. So they are proposing different actions. At least they were back during the EIS, and then they will have finally selected one again. When we go into NEPA, we'll learn more about that, the different alternatives. So there's alternative B, briefly described, alternative C, briefly described. And then no changes is always required by NEPA. So you'll see that the general management plan and NEPA are pretty interwoven here. Table of contents. By now in my classes, you know that any of your reports that are over 10 pages long needs a table of contents, and this one's 400 pages. So here we are, things that we've already talked about, the purpose and need for the plan, and a description of the park. These are things that I ask of you as well in assignments. So here's the history. Here's the Organic Act that we saw from 1916. And then because this is Capitol Reef, it started as a monument, became a national park. So there's a legislative history. Things that we've been talking about. Zoning is something we've been talking about that we will go into more today. So there's a primitive, semi-primitive. Anyway, each national park has slightly different zones, where Forest Service and BLM tend to have one set of zones that apply all the way across. Okay, so there's an idea of what a national park general management plan table of contents looks like. Let's see if we can get back. Okay, hopefully your screen now matches mine with NEPA. And can we get out of that? All right, yes. So we're going to take a look at management zoning. This is different from recreation opportunity because this is National Park Service, who does not use the recreational opportunity spectrum. Each of their parks is unique, and each one is established uniquely. So there are differences from one park to the next. We're going to take a very specific look here at this is Arches, and look at their management zones. I'm not sure what you're seeing arrow-wise. Okay, so management zones. And here's the legend. So if the crosshatch goes this direction, over here by Park Avenue, double arch north window, this is where most of the visitors go. And so there are extra trail systems in those areas. They are the most spectacular within the park. A natural environment, all of the white space in between, that's open desert. It's not quite so special. It looks an awful lot like the open desert that's outside of the park too. It doesn't have the unique land features, arches, fins, rock, slick rock that are in those hatched areas. Okay, so historic development, pretty rare here. It shows up here at the Wolf Ranch and at the petroglyph panel. Oops, up here. There's a petroglyph panel right on the edge of the park that is joint property or adjacent property to down here. You'll see Grand County lands. Okay, the gray hatched areas are Utah State School Trust lands. I'm really surprised they still exist in the park, that they haven't been bought out or traded out. But there they are. That's a management problem they have to deal with. And a utility line does cross. Oops, went the wrong direction. Okay, so just get an idea of management zones. We'll also have recreation zones that are a little bit different. All right, this is another example just to give you that there are other ways of describing things. So in this park, this is part of a NEPA planning tool. They're showing some different zones. So developed, motorized, rural, semi-primitive, primitive, protected, primitive, scenic easement, private inholdings. So just slightly different, but just to let you know that each park is different from the next. And then describing each of those in that last area. The reason they do zoning is so that you can broadly describe what's allowed in an area. So those areas that are labeled primitive, the setting is the natural appearance encounters, so the social setting is less frequent. They don't allow facilities to be built, and it's no motorized access. And what they're expecting the visitor to get from it is isolation from sights and sounds of man, a feeling of closeness to nature, high degree of challenge, infrequent encounters with others. And the activities that are allowed are primitive camping, fishing, nature observation, hiking, climbing, kayaking. And let's go down to the opposite end, the developed down here at the bottom, where it's predominantly a modified landscape that constant encounters with others and vehicles, and definitely shows signs of human occupation. So paved roads, so forth, motorized access. And the expectation for the experience is, yeah, it is going to be development dominant. Opportunities for solitude is not the point there. You shouldn't be needing your outdoor survival skills, and nearly constant contact with others. So the activities that are allowed down here under developed camping, park tours, interpretive activities, bus tours, recreation, vehicles, fishing. So very, very different in contrast. And the whole point of this is to simplify your decision making. You define these things here, and then you go out and draw lines around them and say that that's how we're going to manage those specific sites. Okay, so let's look at arches again specifically. This is now the visitor experience zone, and they just have 3. And this darkest area running through the middle of the park and wise out a little bit. Front country sightseeing. So this is where the paved roads are. The trails are well marked. There is on-site interpretation, and the rangers do guided hikes here. So there are bathrooms, campgrounds, trailheads, and it can be pretty crowded. So you're going to be around others. So most of you, if not every one of you, has been to Arches, and you've been on that road. It's a little spooky to bicycle that road. It's much too narrow. Okay, but there are some backcountry roads. So this paler shade, and it spurs off of the paved road. So here where the lines are a little bit longer, the dashes are longer, most cars can drive that. Certainly there are plenty of little low slung Porsches and such that aren't going to do well there. But your average car can do just fine. But it's not paved. So in a storm, that might become difficult. And then you'll see that they dash the lines here, even though it's not described in the legend. This is high clearance. You probably don't need four-wheel drive. The sand could drift in, but higher clearance. Even a Subaru is going to get bounced a little bit on some of that road. But a pickup truck having to actually go into four-wheel drive, probably not, but it might. not particularly well described. So there are descriptions here of what I just went through written out. So, okay, that is a specific set of visitor experience zones. Looking broader again, what is the scope? How wide, how deep does the general management plan go? Okay, so it does have proposals about resource and how to manage those resources. It talks about land protection, which is a resource. It also talks about cooperation with other local interests, neighbors next door, people who hold permits. There are often inholdings in our national parks of private property. There's going to be a section on describing interpretation and the budget for the interpretation, the acceptable visitor uses, which you've already begun to see in the zoning, special Native American uses. In the Grand Canyon, there's a salt mine that only the Hopi are allowed to go there. So it's an area that it's not advertised, because they've always found that when you advertise something is closed, people go there. There are places in the Little Colorado that are also not to be visited, and they're not advertised. Okay, how much of the park should be accessible for the disabled is going to be described in there. Park operations. So how big of a facilities management? Are you going to be doing all your own paving, all your road plowing in the winter? Or are you going to let your roads be closed? Glacier National Park closes theirs. Yellowstone has special open to oversnow vehicles only. What amount of physical development? There are always boundary issues. Zion National Park, although it was established as a national monument in about 1908, still has people arguing over where the boundaries are and where their private ranch is. Wilderness suitability is required by the 1964 Wilderness Act. Because the national parks manage so much of their area already similarly to wilderness, there aren't a lot of wilderness proposals for national parks. Instead, the energy is put into BLM and Forest Service areas where the protection is needed more. National parks already protect their areas quite well. Mineral management, again, it just depends on how the park was established as to whether there are subsurface rights to minerals. And then, yeah, what's the transportation going to be like? What are the roads going to be? Grand Teton recently, meaning within the last 10 or 15 years, and they're still working on it, putting paved bicycle trails into Grand Teton, coming all the way up from the town of Jackson, and it makes it to Jenny Lake right now, and they're talking about taking that all the way to Jackson Lake, the reservoir. What are they going to do about concessionaires? Who can make money there? Who can have an incidental business permit in there? And backcountry is an issue. How many people? Are you going to do it by permits? Are the permits going to be first come, first serve? Are they going to be lottery? So each park has its own different issues that get addressed, at least broadly in the general management plan, but the specific plans will probably be written out in those project plans. General management plan is going to have a broad outline of when they hope things to get done in the next 15 years, or things that might be beyond that. And there's always a budget proposal, because out of this planning is what you then take to Congress when you're asking for money. And Congress won't give you money until you present a schedule and a budget. It's required by law that you present those. Before you can implement the plan, you also have to have an EIS, and then it also requires funding, so including site-specific projects. So there are an awful lot of things that are hoped to be done and written into that general management plan that may never get done because they're never funded. So let's take a look at phase 3. So these are the smaller plans. and of which I'll show you a backcountry one or introduce you to one at the end. So land-based prescription plans. These are broadly described in the general management plan, but each one of these will have their own separate plan. Every park's going to have a slightly different combination. So a visitor experience plan, that's going to be where all your interpretation is, and you'll see that it overlaps with the access plan, which is going to talk about how are you going to manage your boundaries, your borders, people hiking the Continental Divide Trail. So starting in Mexico, going to Canada or going the other direction. Boy, when they're walking through the Forest Service areas, they don't need a permit, but are they going to need one when they go through Yellowstone? So you have to write a plan about access. What about access from the air? What about access by helicopter? Are those going to be allowed in your area? So natural resource management plan, now we're looking at, bugs and beetles and fire and managing all the living stuff out there and the water, and there's quite a bit to that. Cultural resource management plan, that's mostly looking at historical stuff. So both Native American and early settlement are respected in national parks. And the facilities, who's going to maintain the roads? What's the size of the budget for the roads? What about the buildings? And who are the concessionaires going to be? How many concessionaires can you have? What are they going to be allowed to do? And what areas will they be allowed to operate in? An example coming up here, some special prescriptions. So protected resource area. Just some examples under those zones. So if you have a zone called protected resource, here's a description in a table of a physical setting. Management is geared to protect fragile park resources, and a description of visitor experiences that they want to have happen there. And then over there under protected resource, under experiences, they are saying that this is an area that maybe at some time need restrictions, and even at some times may require temporary closures. And then a description of activities or ones that don't impact the resources. A scenic easement is managed a little bit different, also complementary to the major objectives. The no public access or use, I'm not sure I understand that one because I've never seen a scenic easement describe that. Grazing, I'm glad that's here. Grazing is sometimes permitted in national parks if that was already established prior. Capitol Reef still has some grazing permits, for example. Okay, we are through the big, broad general management plan, and we're going to take a few minutes here. We're getting to almost being finished. Taking a look at this, as I promised, the Canyonlands National Park, Orange Cliffs unit of Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, looking at their project or prescriptive plan for backcountry management. We won't get very far, but you'll get a taste for it. All right, so an executive summary, that's something I sometimes ask of you, that when you're all done with your report in our classes, which you might be doing a 30-page report. This is probably a 60-page planning document. Not everybody's going to want to read the whole thing, nor do they need to, but you can see that you will want to write an executive summary. It may be required. So a description here of actions, of major decisions, and this goes on for 3 pages, I think. I just copied the first page here for you. Okay, table of contents, always needed, any document over 10 pages, and since this goes into the 50 or 60 pages. But let's take a look at it. Purpose and significance, once again, that's the mission statement. And then some other definition, a description of the location, and how is backcountry defined versus front country. And then a brief description of the planning process and how the National Environmental Policy Act helps run planning. Yeah, which does NEPA run planning, or does planning run NEPA? The two are just interwoven. Okay, then things we've already been talking about, a brief description and an outline, probably a drawing right there of zoning. And then going into permit systems, aircraft overflight, bicycle use, caching. Can you cache food? Can you cache water out there? A description of that. And then camping in the backcountry. So all of this is described and can be looked up. If somebody gives them a phone call and asks questions about these, you say, wait a minute, it's on page 8. And you flip there. Okay. A lot of places do have temporary closures, state parks, national parks, and you can see that they address those too. Day use is different from camping. So often day use doesn't require permits. So that will be described here. How is it different from multiple day use? Group size is often different. In Canyonlands in particular, the last time I was there, most sites allowed up to 8 people in a backcountry campsite, but day use was either unlimited or had larger numbers than 8 who could hike together. Commercial use, so here are your outfitters and guides. Anyway, this keeps going. You can read on down through there, and I only again copied up to page 16. Oh, I do have the next page too. Okay. So pets, all of this has to be described. Outfitters and the public. What's the use of pack animals and saddle stock? So is technical rock climbing allowed? A lot of places on our federal lands, if it's a named feature like Delicate Arch or Landscape Arch, then they're not allowed, climbing's not allowed on them. What water use? Are there rivers? Are there lakes? What's allowed there? Anyway, there you go. Looking at that, list of preparers, that's a NEPA thing down there on page 25. And then there are always a bunch of appendices that include maps and descriptions. So anyway, that's giving you an idea there. So that's just the table of content. So here we are looking at just a page or two of the description. I also want you to note that this is report writing. This is not, you don't see anything personal in here about the person who wrote this report. Instead, this is meant to be very readable for all people, all time, well, until it gets out of date. So zoning, we've been talking about zoning, that, and here's in the second paragraph that they're based on fragility and uniqueness and recreational opportunities. So giving a reason for their zoning, and then moving to B, so reservation and permit description described here. Aircraft and oversight. Bicycle use, I already mentioned once. So here we go. Bicycles are classified as vehicles, so all regulations applying to motor vehicles apply to bicycles. This is national parks. Forest Service does allow bicycles on an awful lot of their hiking trails, not in wilderness areas, but and then so it's been an interesting argument over the last few years as electric bikes are becoming more common. The hikers hated bicycles 20, 30 years ago, and were always fighting to keep the bicycles out because they were too fast. And now bicyclists, muscle bicycles, are trying to keep out electric bicycles because they don't think they're earning it. So the argument keeps going from you. People who thought you only earned the right to be there by hiking, and then the people who got to bicycle are saying, oh, you only get to be there if you're doing muscle-powered bicycle. Anyway, it's ongoing. That's something that's happening right now and will for a while. All right, that's it, giving you an idea of getting more and more detailed into these plans. So enjoy that last scene. No bicycles in there. I have kayaked that in high water. All right, thank you very much.